In this lecture, we will survey the Harlem Renaissance and Southern Renaissance to accompany our readings of Claude McKay and William Faulkner. One of the authors we'll encounter this week is Claude McKay. McKay was a Jamaican immigrant who came to the U.S. after a successful nascent career in poetry in Jamaica. He was born the youngest of 11 children to a family that celebrated the Ashanti values and traditions of their grandfather, who had been brought to Jamaica as a slave from West Africa. While still young, McKay was sent off to live with his oldest brother, a schoolteacher, so that he may benefit from the best education available, and when he was 10, he began writing poetry. Encouraged by Walter Jekyll, an English gentleman residing in Jamaica who became McKay's mentor, he began to focus his writing on dialect verse, or verse that uses regional dialect. And after publishing 2 books of dialect verse in 1912, the Jamaican Institute of Arts and Sciences awarded McKay a medal and stipend allowing him to study in the U.S. McKay chose to study agriculture at Tuskegee Institute and later at Kansas State University. He had chosen to attend Tuskegee because he had heard of the accomplishments of Booker T. Washington, the Institute's founder, but ironically, it was at Tuskegee that McKay had his first experiences of American racism. In 1914, when he was 25, he moved to New York City where he became involved in socialism. He believed that racism was intrinsically tied to capitalism, that is, that socioeconomic status is a cause and effect of color lines. Later in life, his involvement with communism put him in the FBI's sights, and he was barred from re-entering the U.S. until 1934, but he would later renounce his association with communism as the purges of political and intellectual undesirables in the Soviet Union became deadly. Some consider McKay's first collection of poetry, Harlem Shadows, published in 1922, to have launched the Harlem Renaissance, but we should by no means see McKay as the definitive or representative voice of the Harlem Renaissance. He disagreed with many other important black figures, including W.E.B. Du Bois, whom we've read, and Alain Locke, who, as we'll see in just a moment, is in part responsible for our conceptualizations of the Harlem Renaissance. We can instead see McKay then as one of the many diverse voices that made up the Harlem Renaissance. So what is the Harlem Renaissance? The Harlem, or New Negro Renaissance, is generally pinpointed as occurring between World War I and the Great Depression, largely because the influx of immigrants following World War I exacerbated those with racist fears, particularly the Ku Klux Klan, resulting in an outburst of responses from the black community. We should also recognize that the roots of the Renaissance go as far back as 1900 to those like W.E.B. Du Bois, whose discussion of double consciousness jump-started awareness of a distinct black American experience and identity. The movement Harlem Renaissance gets its name from the area from which much of the art, music, and literature originated. Harlem is a neighborhood in Manhattan, New York, but the movement was also influenced by writers outside of this area, and thus it may be more appropriate to call the movement the New Negro Renaissance instead. This name was promulgated by Alain Locke's anthology published in 1925, which was titled The New Negro, and collected works that sought to define the diversity of what it meant to be a black American. Locke himself believed that Harlem was the center of a new revolutionary movement, that Harlem, quote, is, or promises at least to be, a race capital. When we're situating the New Negro Renaissance alongside modernism, it's important to recognize the complex relationship the two have. Just as most would distinguish realism and local color, whereas realism typically focuses on white middle-class characters and local color typically focuses on lower-class characters of various races, modernism and the New Negro Renaissance have likewise frequently been distinguished, whereas modernism typically focuses on European peoples and concerns, while the New Negro Renaissance focuses on the local, folk, and so-called primitive. However, just as the local color contributed the concerns of the rural and regional to realism, the New Negro Renaissance contributes the concerns of the marginalized to modernism. In other words, you can consider the New Negro Renaissance as either a part of modernism and or parallel to modernism. The issues at stake during the Renaissance were diverse. While some, like Marcus Garvey, the founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, promoted a Back to Africa movement, others, like Du Bois, advocated the cultivation of an educated American elite called the Talented Tenth. While some argued that leadership of black Americans should be politically centered, others argued that it should be cultural in origin. While some argued that all art produced should further the lives and prospects of blacks, others pointed to the irrationality of such goals, saying that until the black community becomes urbanized, more racially aware, and more literate, artists cannot hope to sustain themselves by writing solely about and for black people. Ultimately, the market expanded sufficiently to support this kind of growth, and we see an explosion of writers, artists, and musicians striving to make a living off their works. But then the big question became whether artists should employ folk material or experimental forms, a question probing the double consciousness of Black artistry in the early 20th century. That is, to embrace a Black past or to claim a part of the otherwise largely European modernist movement. And so this was a central issue for writers, artists, and musicians of Harlem. On one hand, use of experimental forms would demonstrate that the new Negro artists were conversant with the latest artistic trends, keeping up with the modernist push to revive art and culture by breaking free of traditional forms. But many Black readers didn't have the luxury to participate in this conversation. They were not middle class consumers, pillowed by suburban life and benefiting from an extended educational system. They simply didn't have the time or money to take an interest in aesthetic experiments. In addition, much of high modernism focused on the fragmentation of self. But African American writers were trying to speak for an oppressed people, and so adopting the modernist experimental form wasn't always conducive to this unifying goal. However, the other option, to use traditional forms like folk tales or slave narratives, may seem condescending, a reinforcement of past literary traditions that degraded and stereotypes blacks as lazy and ignorant. Yet still, many new Negro artists were born in the North or urban areas, and the use of folk material was means of rediscovering the Black South and framing conversations about repression, exploitation, liberation, and revolt. Meanwhile, in the South, another Renaissance was brewing. Reacting to the seemingly monolithic modernism of the Northeast, Southern Renaissance writers localized modernism to the concerns and issues of the South. Foremost in the minds of many Southerners after the Civil War was the question of honor in the Southern identity. And in attempts to preserve the honor of the South in the face of defeat, some advocated a return to an idyllic antebellum South, which emphasized the values of family, tradition, heroism, and white supremacy. These people called themselves Lost Cause supporters and typically tried to downplay the importance of slavery as a main cause of the Civil War. Instead, they argued that the war had been about the rights of states to secede, and that focus should be not on their defeat, but on the courage that had been displayed by Confederate soldiers on the field. Note that part of this response is a reaction to the gender anxieties of the early 20th century as well. The return to an antebellum South necessitates masculine men who protect and control their domains at home as well as in the larger political and cultural arenas. The lost cause belief is also fueled by anti-industrial sentiment, similar to the sentimentality we saw in local color fiction, which seeks to preserve agrarian life and culture. Now, the Southern Renaissance is not solely defined by this group, but as a reaction to this group and those with similar sentiments. And so Southern Renaissance writers run the gamut of supporting and critiquing these nostalgic ideals. Some writers use traditional forms to stress traditional agrarian social values, while others use experimental forms and critique the conservatism, racism, and history of the South. Just as the New Negro movement sought to identify the new Black American, but came to no unified conclusion, the Southern Renaissance sought to address the new postbellum identity of the South, which met with support and resistance. William Faulkner is a writer of the Southern Renaissance. He was born in New Albany and raised in Oxford, Mississippi. His great-grandfather, Colonel William Faulkner, had been a local legend, a Civil War hero, and popular writer whose tales of greatness mesmerized a young Faulkner and inspired him to his own soldierly and writerly heights. In fact, when he was 21, tales of grandeur in his head, he joined the Royal Air Force of Canada. They trained him as a cadet pilot, but then in short order sent him home. But not letting this faze him or his ambitious imagination, Faulkner proceeded to strut around his hometown, telling tales of his grand exploits abroad, pretending to have seen combat at the front in France. He soon turned his energies towards nursing a burgeoning creative career. He attended school at the University of Mississippi, dropped out, worked at a bookstore, met his future wife, published his first book of poetry, The Marble Faun, and moved to New Orleans, where he became immersed in literary circles, largely thanks to the connections of his wife. While in New Orleans, he absorbed the despair of the lost generation, and like a conventional modernist, eventually left for Europe, where he traveled Italy, England, and France. When he returned, encouraged by fellow novelist Sherwood Anderson, he began writing and publishing the novels for which he is now famous, all set in Yoknapatawpha County, a fictional county based on his home region of Oxford and the surrounding area. He's particularly known for employing what is sometimes called Southern Gothicism, that is a subgenre of American Gothicism that features the decay of the Old South. At the surface, this entails some kind of fall of the Southern aristocracy or white upper class. Beyond this, Southern Gothicism confronts the haunting past of the Old South and engages with the turmoil of emotions that continues to disrupt the modern sense of Southern identity. In particular, this might mean, for example, confronting the racial guilt of the South, but it also might mean generally dismantling the veneer of civilization that maintains the facade of an idyllic past, or in other words, unveiling the darker, disruptive emotions that drive the self-conflicted feelings of loyalty and self-loathing, or sentiment and irony, in the modern Southern identity. These revelations are facilitated by common Gothic devices. For instance, there might be supernatural machinery like ghosts, uncanny plots that unsettle us like the revelation that someone is alive whom we once thought was dead, or vice versa, wild landscapes and claustrophobic rooms, scenes that reflect the internal states of a character who is mad or repressed, and of course, terror of the irrepressible.